Councillor Fred Grindrod, I can't remember the name, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And you're just monitoring the attendance, are you?
Yes, Chair. So currently you're not quorum, but I will let you know when you are and if you do become so.
Lovely, thank you very much. Looking at the agenda, has anybody got a declaration of interest they want to alert us to? I'll take that as a no, thank you very much. And the minutes, the 26th of October minutes, you've all seen those. May I have permission to sign those off? Again, all right, thank you very much. I have no particular remarks. What I've done is to work with the monitoring officer, Tim, and colleagues in the CA to split our agenda. I think the biggest issue we have at the moment is that one or two things, understandably, have got delayed. And so I wrote out to everybody, and I apologise for asking this of you, to ask for an extra meeting at the beginning of March, which enabled us to not cram the standard April meeting, which I think was the biggest risk. So if I had any report, it's just that I've been working with the Combined Authority to make sure that we can still bring stuff forward, but we've had to introduce the second meeting. So other than that, I don't have anything I want to raise. Any questions for me on that? So moving on, if I can, to matters arising, we've chosen to put a number of topics, a few topics, into the matters arising to deal with them quite quickly as updates, not to try and shove something through under speed. So Tim, would you like to run with the few things we've got, and then I'll hand to Lorraine?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody. So the first of the matters arising is our normal report on whistleblowing. A number of investigations have been closed without any findings of concern. The two more recent referrals are still under investigation. The Chair has been briefed on the outcomes of these matters, but more importantly, I've agreed with internal audit and with the Chair that from the next meeting we will institute a slightly changed process whereby we'll have an update on whistleblowing matters on the confidential part of the agenda at the end of the meeting, just so members can be up to speed. Obviously, investigations have been carried out and there are no matters of concern as a result, then obviously reporting will be light, but obviously in the event that there was anything that we needed to draw to your attention, that would be a good opportunity to do so, because the matters are likely to be confidential. So that's my report on whistleblowing. I'll just pause for a second if there are any questions, although I can't see any hands. No, I'll move on, Chair. Internal audit plan. We'll be bringing a report on the draft internal audit plan to our additional meeting that the Chair's just mentioned. We're working on this at the moment. We'll be obviously briefing the Chair on our progress before that meeting, but at the moment we're working on producing the draft internal audit plan. It's based around obviously what we think we can draw out from our risk register and trying to link the audit plan with the areas that are of most significant importance and most significant risk for the authority. We're working on this through the Statutory Officers Group, which is myself, Linda Horn, and the Chief Executive, and with senior leadership team. And as I said, we'll also consult with your Chair before bringing the draft forward. And so again, obviously there'll be some audits in that which happen every year, such as things like the key financial systems audit. So they appear anyway. So again, any questions or points on that before I move on?
I just would like to add to what Tim just said. There is always going to be a constant tension between the need to balance how we can get these audits done sensibly without complicating the Combined Authority and it looking like or being perceived that we are delaying things because it suits the Combined Authority to do so. And that's a tension that continues on a regular debate between Tim and myself. I am confident from what I can see and the debates that we have, that when we do decide something has to be delayed, that this is not because it's convenient for the Combined Authority, but because it makes a lot of sense. But I would hate members of ARIC to think that that isn't a debate that we don't have on a regular basis.
Thank you, Chair. And then the third point, which I was going to report on, was the response to COVID-19. There's a detailed report on the agenda from Tracy about what we've done, particularly around our workforce. So I won't duplicate any of that. Just to say, in terms of the matters that I've reported on previously, there's little change to report at the moment. We're still heavily involved in resilience and response work and planning for the recovery. But that obviously, you know, we are still on hold with a lot of that recovery work because of the resurgence of the virus in recent weeks. So, you know, we're still heavily involved in the response work. TFWM colleagues are obviously working hard to respond to the transport requirements. They've ramped up the transport when things have been better. They've reduced it when there's been restrictions on travel. One of the key things that they've been working on recently is making sure that with the reduced network that is available, that people can still get to the vaccination centres. So we've been working with the local resilience forums on that, and that's you know, a really good piece of joint working. Day-to-day work, I think it's fair to say that the day-to-day work of the combined authority has been little impeded by the current situation with people working from home. There are some longer-term issues which obviously we will try to address, and again, Tracy's paper deals with some of that. But at the moment, you know, the work is ongoing, as it will be in all of your organisations. And perhaps one of the surprises of the pandemic, in a sense, has been the ease with which, in the short term, certainly, we've transferred over to remote working. We will be looking at a return to the office as and when that is feasible, but obviously that may well not look like it did before. There will be changes to the way in which we work. And I think the lesson of the last few months really is not to rush things. We certainly don't want to be in a situation of rushing a return to the office and then finding that, you know, we have staff becoming unwell, all that sort of thing. So, you know, we're keeping the situation under review on an ongoing basis. So again, that, I think, David, is all that I would report at this stage.
Thank you. Linda is going to give us a financial update a little bit further in the agenda, so I won't refer to Linda at the moment. And maybe, Julie, at the end of Linda's comment, you might want to just give a bit of an update on the government relations and the strategic side of it. Alex, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just very quickly to Tim about going back into the office. Just wondered about longer term, whether there be a plan to actually downsize the offices, use far less space, and sublet. I mean, certainly in Shropshire, that's what we're doing. We're probably looking to go and sell our Shire Hall buildings and move into a far smaller space in the town centre, have that open to the public so it's all visible, making a presence, but at the same time it will have capacity for far fewer people than there would have been beforehand. The assumption will be a far higher amount of home working going forward, with people occasionally going into the office for meetings or networking purposes.
Chair, yes, if I can just respond to that. I mean, I think like all authorities, we are looking at those possibilities very seriously. We obviously haven't got any settled plans at this stage because it's just really hard to know exactly how things are going to settle out. But certainly our plans for future agile working would indicate that we would expect fewer people to be in the office every day. Maybe on a rolling basis, you know, people would be coming in maybe 1 or 2 days a week and that sort of thing. But I think I'd just like to stress at this stage that nothing's been actually ruled in or ruled out. Whether or not we could dispose of Summer Lane is a decision that we simply haven't taken yet. And I would just point out also that there are other tenants in the building, other public sector tenants. So, you know, we'd have to consult with those as well. But, you know, clearly we're not just expecting to push a button and have all of our staff back in the office 5 days a week, because I think you'll see from the next report on the agenda that, you know, a lot of staff have said, despite the practical difficulties and obviously some difficulties, particularly around childcare and that sort of thing, but you know, a lot of staff have said they like working from home some of the time. But I think we'd all probably identify with the idea that 5 days a week for a year is possibly a bit much, and it would be nice to see some of our colleagues again in the flesh. And we just have to work through that as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Tim. Anything else anybody else wants to raise? Okay. Lorraine, you were going to update everybody where we are on the arm's length company annual audit. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As you'll all be aware, we do a review of the governance arrangements that are in place for the arm's length companies that are linked to the combined authority annually. And we usually report this back to this committee January every year. The work has been progressing very well, but there has been a slight delay in the process, only due to me requiring evidence to support some of the statements that the arm's length companies have made. This information now has all been received, and so we're just completing a final review in readiness for full reporting, which will be provided to the committee at their next meeting in March.
I was quite happy with that. I was asked about that. I felt that we would rather do it properly in slightly more constrained times than rush it for this meeting. Is everybody happy with us taking that at the March meeting? I'll take that as a yes. Thank you, Lorraine.
Agreed, Chair, agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Forward plan, Tanya.
Yes, Chair, happy to take any amendments, or it's as read.
Anybody got any amendments? I suspect things will arise as we go through the meeting, but has anybody got anything that stands out at the moment? I'll take that as a no. Thank you. I'm now going to move to item 7. And there are actually two elements to this. One is Tracy's update, and she's just going to summarise the paper. She's not going to go through it. And then Internal Audit had done a review of this and given a very substantial report. And so I will probably pass to Sandra or Peter to just finish off Tracy's report. Bearing in mind this was a subject that had worried members over the lockdown period, I commend this to you. It, to me, reads as an exceptionally good piece of work. So Tracy, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. As the Chair has indicated, this report sets out how the CA has supported particularly the mental health and wellbeing of its staff during the first and second lockdowns. You'll appreciate, as Tim indicated, that most but not all of our staff have been working from home. Clearly, we also have staff who are working out face-to-face on the network. However, what this report looks at is how we've supported those staff who've been working remotely from the period from April to November of last year, and the support that we put into place to help them to do that, to not only work confidently, but also to be productive whilst working from home. The report describes both the efforts we've made to keep staff properly informed and feeling connected to the organisation through a number of channels, such as our weekly staff webinar, which has continued, and regular guidance and FAQs. And in fact, this morning we sent out another set of management guidance and FAQs, which helps staff keep up to date with the latest the latest government guidance. The work that we've done, in particular around supporting mental health, has helped us to gain a Thrive at Work award, which we're really pleased about. And we've recently shared that work with other local authorities in an article that we have published in the Municipal Journal just before Christmas, entitled Creating Great Days at Work. In terms of measures, we've maintained low levels of reported sickness absence throughout this period, and also take-up of our employee assistance programme is around average, and I'd like to think that's because we've put plenty of support in place for staff, so they haven't had to rely on the assistance programme and actually accessing counselling. We surveyed our staff twice during the first and second lockdowns. We surveyed them just as we came out of lockdown in July, and again in November, just as we went into the second lockdown. And despite the fact that people were in a second lockdown, they reported very similar results to the first survey, which was that people were largely coping really well from home. And in fact, many people were enjoying the opportunity to work from home. Certainly some, as Tim indicated, were reporting missing that face-to-face contact with teammates. But by and large, people felt that they were working productively, they knew how to access support, they were speaking to their managers and their teams on a regular basis. So it was a very positive response that we had. In the longer term, we want to use that feedback from staff to look at more agile working, as Tim suggested. And we ran a series of 6 workshops during November and December of last year, where we talked to over 200 staff around agile working. And we're looking at rolling out a wider strategy later this year. What that looks like, I cannot give you the detail of that at the moment, as linked to our wider kind of strategy. But what most of our staff said is they'd like us to take a hybrid approach to working. So that means part-time at home, part-time from potentially other remote locations, perhaps hubs around the West Midlands, and partly coming into the office. And that seems to work for most staff. Very small numbers of staff wanted to come back to the office full-time, around 4%, which is a very small number. And I have to say that those staff in particular are struggling from home and have really benefited from the support that we put into place. So as I said, we're keen to capitalise on the feedback that we've had from staff and what we've learnt, and that desire that we think that staff have to change the ways in which we work in future. Thank you, Chair. Happy to answer any questions.
Can't hear you, Chair.
You're on mute.
Sorry, yes, thank you. I'm just going to ask Peter and Sandra to make a comment regarding the internal audit substantive report, which I think adds value to what Tracy's just said. Peter, who's going to represent the update? You.
Yep, thank you, Chair. I can give a quick update on that. Obviously, following on from what Tracy said, in the last 2 or 3 months, as your internal auditors, we also did a review of the Combined Authorities' response to COVID-19 with regards to the way that the employment management was undertaken. And really, we just, our findings sort of mirrored exactly what Tracy has just explained to you, that we felt the Combined Authority had dealt with it really well. Details of it are included in our update report, which is next on the agenda, and also, slightly unusually, but because it was of interest to ARAC, we've appended a full copy of our report. It's a different report because there are no findings in there. Normally we only report by exception, but because of the good work that CA have done in this area, we thought it would be useful for members to have sort of the full details, the full story behind that. Hence why you've got quite a lengthy report in there. But as I say, really, it just independently confirms what Tracy has just explained to you, and no findings from us, substantial assurance, and CA dealt with it really well. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I had agreed that we ought to just have that because this had been a topic that I think had worried a number of members, and this is something where I think it would be fairly rare that an organisation that was dealing with this for the first time would come out with such a strong positive report from everybody. So the lessons were being learnt quickly and being dealt with quickly. So that's, I think, is very good news. Alex, you've got your hand up first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just on that figure, Tracy, thanks for the presentation. The 4% of people wanting to come back to the office full time. So what was the, maybe I missed it, what was the percentage figure for people wanting to work at home full time?
Yeah, which was, this was a survey that was done in July and again in November. So in July, 57% of people said they were happy to continue to work from home full time going forward. Now, the caveat behind that is, it's a good result, but the caveat behind that is this was as we were coming out of restrictions. People were perhaps sitting in their garden when filling out the questionnaire. So that's the caveat behind it. However, when we surveyed staff again in November, although the figure had dropped, it hadn't dropped substantially. So that what people were reporting wasn't an issue with working from home, it was an issue around COVID. So 19% of staff said in November they were feeling sad, but when asked why they were feeling sad, 22% of all staff said they had COVID fatigue. So they were fed up of going back and down into lockdown again. And I think it's really important when we look at agile working, we look at the distinction between, are people comfortable working from home outside of a pandemic? And I think the answer is probably people are quite comfortable as long as they've got the right equipment, they've got the right support, they're seeing members of their team on a regular basis, they're in touch with their managers. Actually, people are by and large happy with working from home. That's not to say that happy working from home permanently 5 days a week, but actually people are pretty content. What they're not happy with is coronavirus, understandably.
Thank you, Alex.
Okay, thanks.
Any follow through, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's some jobs which are particularly suited from working from home. I mean, certainly my wife is involved at Ministry of Justice. They're looking at more agile working, home working. And just maybe with a small p politics to look at a way the WMCA can extend its reach. As a member of a non-constituent member authority, I'm sure we'd have, for example, quite a few talented PAs who live in Oswestry who would be perfectly able to go and do the job for WMCA officers in Birmingham, just simply would never need to come into the office.
Yeah.
Just wondering if there's scope for that in the future, which is widening the recruitment areas, advertising more widely. So it means that, you know, people in the outer regions of the WMCA non-constituents can feel more of the direct benefits. So it means that when I go back to my council and say, oh, by the way, we're still, excuse my French, ponying up 25 grand a year, which is a good value of my money, then we can give a bigger demonstration of how the WMCA is benefiting us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I really like the idea of virtual assistants. I mean, there's been virtual assistants who've been out there working for a long time in the business sector. It's just not something we've got to grips with in a sort of a local or combined authority. But I would absolutely agree. The vast majority of jobs can be done from home, provided people have got adequate support and they're feeling, you know, confident. They can absolutely be productive from home. So I would absolutely share that view. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Tracy. Alex, 10 out of 10 for being first on the sales pitch.
Of course, you know, Shropshire like heart. House proud.
Michael, you're next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So some good reading in the report, and you know, the trend seems to be pretty much what we're seeing over in Solihull, you know, with regard to the agile working. I do have one concern which I'd just like to raise, really, and that's around sickness. Do you think there may be a possibility of us, because people being at home and actually not being in the office, there is actually sickness that we're not picking up on? Is that something that's being considered?
So when I looked at the sickness absence, I've not looked just at during the pandemic, I've looked over the last couple of years. So we set a target a couple of years ago, it was August in 2018, that we would drive down our sickness absence, because at the time it was running at 8.5 days per person per year. And we did quite a lot of work with staff and with trade unions to bring that level down, and our target now is 6 days per person per year, and actually in November it was running at less than 5 days per person per year, which is unusually low for the public sector. So what I was looking at was whether or not that had changed during the pandemic at all. And what we did do was we did say to people, if you're feeling unwell and you have what you think are then COVID-like symptoms, we want you to self-isolate. You want you to report that and self-isolate. You will not be penalised under our sickness reporting policy. So we suspended the policy and the triggers where people reported having COVID-like symptoms. Now, remember, this was the time of the first lockdown where there was no testing available. So people were simply ringing 111, reporting the symptoms and being told then to self-isolate. And we were encouraging people to do that. And I think that did two things. I think the first thing is that actually people came forward. That was the first thing. And I think the second thing is that people didn't feel as though they had to hide what was potentially, you know, COVID-like symptoms, and then put themselves at risk and their families and potentially other people at risk. So we encouraged that. I think that was a responsible thing to do. So for those purposes, that's not recorded in terms of our sickness absence. We took those out of the sickness absence stats. However, we've had relatively few numbers of people who've reported COVID-like symptoms. And we have been monitoring that. We monitor it on a daily basis. We are obliged, as I'm sure you know, from public health, to report when we have more than 2 staff like symptoms, and we report that daily and have been monitoring that very closely. So I think we took a fairly relaxed, pragmatic view, but deliberately. I guess the stats, though, what they suggest is that people are no more likely to be mentally unwell, which is what I was particularly interested in looking at. Have our long-term sickness absence stats gone up because of mental health problems? The answer is no, they haven't. So it's about average for us.
Thank you, Tracy. Anything else, Michael?
No, thank you, Tracy. I mean, you hit on exactly what I was concerned with. It was more the mental health situation than the COVID. But I'm glad to see you've got a handle on that as well. Thank you for your response.
Thank you. Ram, I think you're next.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's following up for that, because on the report, actually on the section 6, there's a financial impact issue. I'm just trying to think. It says very little actually, any cost or something in it mentioned what actually costs and has gone up and so on. Certainly, IT people have done a wonderful job. Let's be realistic, it's not just here, it's everywhere. The IT has gone far further than what we would have done otherwise. And they have done a wonderful job, and we sometimes don't say enough. And we rely on them all the time. And the issue what I want to understand is from there, let's be realistic, no matter how we say it's normal, going to back to normal and so on. When that new normal comes, it won't be exactly the same because we learned new things, how to use these technologies and so on. So what percentage of the workforce we are likely to see back? Let's say 50%. I know it's difficult to guess at the moment because we have to look at all the other aspects of childcare and everything else. Are we expecting about 50% workforce coming back to the offices or something like that? So that helps to understand where we stand for future.
Okay, so I'll take your first question first, which was around budget for wellbeing. So we have a budget of around £30,000 a year, okay, which is currently has been derived from our car parking. So we charge people for parking in our car park, and we use that budget then to pay for wellbeing type activities. Over the course of the next 12 months or so, we think we're going to need considerably less than that, because what we've done is we've put everything online. So all of our classes have gone online, all of our webinars have gone online. So actually that's much cheaper to run our kind of wellbeing strategy than it has been while we were in the office. So we've set up a task to finish group, which is met twice, and we're looking at how we can cost that out going forward, but it should be less expensive than it previously was. In terms of numbers of staff going back, I think it's somewhere between 25 and 40% of staff will be back in the office at any time. So I'm thinking that it will be a hybrid approach. So I might work from home 3 days a week and go in the office 2 days a week, or work from home 4 days a week, go in the office 1 day a week. But I cannot imagine large numbers of staff going back 5 days a week, because I think this has worked. As you said, we've all learned lots and lots of things. Who'd heard of Zoom before this time last year? I haven't. This has been fantastic for all those companies, hasn't it? So I think people have enjoyed it, and personally, people who know me know I'm a complete technophobe, but I've learned so many new skills over the course of the last 10 months because I've had to. So actually, it's been fantastic in upskilling our staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I think we always also saved some.
Thank you, Ram. Alex, you've got your hand up still. Is that by accident?
By accident, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Tracy, well done. I think this is a good piece of work. What would be helpful if you would be prepared and able, middle of the year, to give what might be a type of end of term report on how things turned out after the third lockdown, because I hope we won't be going back into another. I don't think it needs to be a full report, but it will be useful just to see what changes, if any, occurred as we come out of it.
Yes, Chair, I'll be very happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Moving on then, Peter, Sandra, onto the internal audit report.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to briefly recap with ARAC members as to the role of internal audit. At the start of the year, we agreed an internal audit plan with the CA and ultimately yourselves. Throughout the year, we deliver a range of internal audit reviews and subsequent reports. We bring summary progress reports to you throughout the year. Then at the end of the year, all of that feeds into my annual report as the head of audit, where I then give an opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the CA's governance, internal control and risk management processes. This is sort of midway through the stage where we're starting to complete the majority of the audit plan now, and just bringing you up to date with the progress we've made since we last met. As you can see on page 20, the report, we've completed the 6 key financial system reviews. 4 of them, we're pleased to report, with substantial assurance, although there were 2, accounts payable and treasury management, where, because we found a couple of issues, we gave those satisfactory assurance. And Sandra will briefly touch upon some of the issues that we found in these audits after I've just finished the summary, as well as the 6 key financial systems reviews. We've also completed and issued 3 other final internal audit reports. One you've just heard about on the employee management and the COVID-19 response, which again was we found the CA had responded excellently. There are 2 other reports which are also appended to this progress report. There's one on environmental management system, again where we've given satisfactory assurance, and the 3rd and final report is on HR pre-employment checks, where again just found a couple of issues. Now, I just wanted to highlight that review wasn't actually in the internal audit plan, but as a result of the work that we've done on payroll, that flowed through where we found a couple of issues that we thought we needed to flag, but they didn't really sit well within the payroll report as such, because they weren't directly related to payroll. So on that occasion, we've produced this separate report for the CA and yourselves. And again, Sandra will very briefly touch upon the issues in that shortly. On to the remainder of the plan. As you can see, we plan to bring 2 further reports to the new March meeting, as that's just been agreed earlier today. And then in April, we'll be bringing another 2 or 3 reports, and the final 2 reports in June of this year. There are 2 further reviews that were planned in the audit plan at the start of the year around the investment programme and bid management, but we have agreed with the chair that those will now be deferred to 21-22, so they will sort of form the start of next year's plan rather than be tagged on to the end of this year's plan. So hopefully you can see we've made steady progress. We've got all the remainder of the reviews scheduled in to be completed, and we'll be bringing them back before ARAC. I'm just going to hand over to Sandra, who does the vast majority of the work at the CA. She's just going to touch upon 1 or 2 issues that she's found since we last met, just to bring to your attention. Thank you. Sandra?
Okay, thank you. As you'll see on page 21-22, we provided a summary, just starting with the employee management COVID-19 response. That pretty much, as Peter and Tracy have explained, mirrors the earlier report. And we covered 4 areas: protecting the organisation's employees, communicating effectively, maintain the continuity of work, and preparing for recovery. And we felt that one of the key things, it was very easy to see the response, which I think justifies the substantial assurance opinion, to be able to reflect in this report all the different mechanisms that have been put in place, the support that has been explained, and we've appended the report, as Peter and David have said, for your interest further down in the report. And it is in more detail because we felt it was better to reflect all the different actions that had been taken, the support put in place, and how it had integrated with the wider response as well. So if there's any further questions on that, or I'll move on.
Move on, Sandra, and we'll come
Okay, so key financial systems. We gave accounts payable and treasury management a satisfactory. They were largely issues to do with supplier bank detail change processes and maintaining the audit trail for approvals. Similar issue on treasury management, but we believe that was because of the change in from manual authorization in the office to remote working, and I think as time has gone by, that will in itself improve as that practice is embedded as people work from home. So it's just a different way of working and accounting for how those approvals should be evidenced. Those are the main summaries. We also, if I take you down to the human resources pre-employment checks, again, there were 2 specific issues, one to do with recording the right to work check, and the other was verifying qualifications where a role required that. HR, as soon as we'd picked that up, had put into action changes to make sure that that was rectified, and worked with their team to ensure that that was corrected going forward. So we will follow that up in due course.
Thank you, Sandra. Tracy, from the HR point of view, quickly, the report that talks about the pre-employment checks had 2 December the 31st deadlines. Can you just confirm whether or not you've hit those?
Yes, I believe that we have. I think that some of the difficulties, Chair, were around us moving from working in the office to working remotely. So normally we would take those checks in the office. And of course, we moved the entire team working from home within 48 hours. And I think that actually in our very quick and proactive response to COVID, to be frank with you, something that we should have dealt with immediately at the time, but we didn't. So apologies for that. We have rectified it. The business partnering team, I can confirm, are now taking up all of those checks, and we have actually onboarded successfully a number of staff. I'm very happy to report back on that, just to give committee assurance going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And Linda, before I throw the floor open to questions, do you want to comment on the financial systems report?
Yeah, I think it's a similar issue, really. I think that was us moving across to online working. I'm happy that we've picked that up and the recommendations have been implemented. So it's about us how we evidence stuff rather than the fact that it wasn't approved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Linda. One thing I just mentioned to members, Peter, Tim and I have agreed a new approach. When changes occur to the audit plan or to reports, in terms of prior approval, it will come to the chair, whether it's me or my successor, in advance, so that what we do have an opportunity to do is ARAC, through me or the chair, has the opportunity to raise a question. And that's not because I doubt the process that's going on. It's just to make sure that ARAC always has the confidence that it's not being put off for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. And I mention it here just so that it's minuted that that's the process that we're now moving to. Peter, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good point that you raised there, David, and we're happy to work along those lines. Obviously, audit plans over the 12-month period will necessarily change in year, and the year that we've just had has seen, such a tremendous unexpected event that really would have been ridiculous for the plan as was pre-COVID to reflect the work that's been undertaken during the year. So it makes perfect sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Can I throw the floor open to questions? Anybody wish to raise anything? I see no. Oh, yes, I do. Sean, thank you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair. I haven't got a question, actually, more a comment, if I may. Peter's just said that with 2020 having been such an unusual and unforeseen year that obviously we couldn't stick to the original timetable and original plan. I usually give Peter a little bit of an ear bashing on the internal audit section of ARAC, but today I have none for you, Peter. You'll be pleased to know. I just wanted to congratulate you on the work that's been done. I actually think you've done a sterling job, you and your team, and I'm very happy with the report that we've had this morning. Jen.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that.
Yes, praise indeed. One of the questions that will be tackled at the March meeting when we look at the internal audit plan will be internal audit resource. And whilst it's not been resolved between Tim, Peter and myself yet, it is an open debate, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to come forward, A, with the plan, but B, an understanding of how the resource will allow us to cope. So I'm parking that for the moment. So no other questions on internal audit? Good. Well done, Peter. Well done, Sandra. Thank you very much. Moving on then, Grant, I think you may have the floor, but I wonder whether Linda wishes to lead first. Linda?
Yeah, it's just we have the annual audit letter, so it's the key findings from the audit, summary of that. It's a statutory requirement, and it's essentially closing the accounts for last year. Finally, the March meeting is when we will bring, or when Grant will bring, should I say, the plan for the current year's accounts. So it's a never-ending cycle. But yeah, over to Grant.
Okay, Grant, before I hand to you, we're not quorate today. I was given delegated authority at a previous meeting to be able to sign this off. So what I'm going to is to allow Grant to talk, allow any questions to come up, and subject to there not being any dissent from around the room, I'm going to take the previous approval that I've had from the quorum meeting to then say that we can sign it off for the board to then agree. Is everybody happy with that line?
Yeah, okay.
Good.
Agreed,
Grant?
Chair, agreed.
Okay.
Agreed, happy.
Thank you. Grant, you have the ball.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't think there's a formal actual statutory requirement for you to sign this off, but I think I've got to explain the way it's our letter to yourselves. But yes, approval of audit committee before board is helpful. Yeah, so as Linda explained, annual audit letter effectively summarising findings from our report. And I think, as I've said in the past, the key one is it's meant to be more aimed at members of the public than necessarily ARAC in that sense. So whilst we do try and change the wording to try and make it a bit more user friendly, I suppose in a way, you've seen a lot of the information that's in here already before, so I won't dwell on that. But just to bring members up to speed, yes, as Linda says, we did issue our opinion, unqualified opinion on the authority and the group's financial statements at the end of November. So that was in line with the statutory deadline, and it did include, I think, as we'd indicated previously to ARAC, that there was an emphasis on matter paragraph, not a modification of our audit report, but that was in respect of investment properties that are held within Westminster pension funds on behalf of effectively your share of those in relation to the authority. So we just drew users of the account's attention to that fact that within that element is a degree of material uncertainty around those valuations. And again, there was an unqualified value for money conclusion, and we did certify our audit close at that point in time as well. I suppose just reminding members, if I move on, I think to page 5 of our report, which I think is page 61 in the pack, just highlight there the impact of COVID. As you've heard already, we did have to consider that as part of our audit. We did revise our planning for that. The only thing coming out of that, okay, we didn't identify, which is consistent with what you've heard today, any specific issues around COVID that relate to our audit for last year. However, we did bring the attention to the issues around the valuation of the pension fund investments coming out of that. As I say, moving on, no issues around fraudulent transactions or use of or management overriding internal controls. And also in respect of, I suppose, the pension fund liability, in respect of that, no issues around that. There were some relatively big movements around the experience gains for this year. That's primarily coming out of the 3-year triennial valuation. But again, no issues identified from our audit in relation to that, as part of the emphasis of matter, which relates into that in the assets, which will share of the assets. Moving on slightly to, I think, page 8 of our report, which is page 64 of your pack. Just a confirmation there that we did agree and discuss the changes required in the accounting for the land fund, and they're summarised there. We did complete whole of government accounts. You're below the thresholds, no significant issues or no issues identified from our perspective. And then we do summarise on the third pages our value for money conclusion. These are consistent with what we've reported to you in the past in relation to that. No matters arising around our work on the adult education work stream. We do note that internal audit, I think, and there's a report still in progress around that. However, we're satisfied that overall there's no significant weaknesses that we've identified for value for money purposes. Similarly, around the investment programme, clearly recognising that the challenges the authority along with the sector is experiencing around COVID and delivery. But no issues in respect of your arrangements for monitoring that and for delivering that. And similarly, the governance of WM5G. I know you've got another further report coming around the governance around the companies coming, but from our work, there was no issues identified around that as well. So again, an unqualified value for money conclusion. And the one thing, probably the new element to bring to your attention, I think we have two elements on the final bit around fees and reports issued, is in relation to the audit fee for this year. We have experienced it's taken longer from remote working. We've been able to obtain appropriate audit evidence and assurance, but we are seeing that it is taking longer to complete audits. Therefore, I think at last audit meeting we flagged this, but we are proposing a further variation to audit fee, and we've not entered into this lightly of around 15%, and that really is consistent with fee variations around all of our client base where there's been no other significant issues identified. There is a small also additional fee in relation to the additional work we did have to carry out in relation to the land fund this year as well. So I am bringing that to your attention as Charter of Governance, that we will be seeking that fee variation. It needs to go through PSAA for their approval, but we have had high level discussions with Linda around that, and a lot of that was around we had to change our approach to COVID planning. There was remote working in that and a risk profile, and that has been driving the additional time we've had to put into the audit.
You've gone quiet, Grant. Is that because you've finished? Right. I assume he's frozen.
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
Anything else you want to add?
No, if I just bring it as, sorry, David, just attention around our advisory colleagues have done some work for the Department of Transport, indirect work, and we're just highlighting that. It's not an independence issue.
Thank you very much. Lynn, did you wish to comment on the status of the fee point that that Grant raises? Not that I'm expecting a negotiation here, but since ARAC have been advised, do you want to just comment on that?
So yeah, we are having discussions around that. It does need to go through the PSAA. We'll bring that back via yourself, David, at an appropriate point. As you're aware, I think the PSAA are consulting on the future of audit fees anyway, because they're recognising nationally that there is pressure on external audit, an increasing pressure on external audit. I have to say as well, the combined authority, the increasing activity of the combined authority means that the audit is getting more and more complex, so it's not an unreasonable ask from Grant, but as I say, the level of that fee is yet to be negotiated between us.
Coming from Linda, Grant, that's a great positive.
I'm taking that. I mean, I think, to be honest, David, we'll have to come back with you on two reasons, because looking forward, this is retrospective, but as Linda's highlighted, there is a new approach to value for money this year as well. Now, MHCLG has highlighted there are additional funds available, I think, but to pick up on the Redmond report on this. So that, yes, I think there will be more coming forward about general fees as well in the next month, next couple of months as well, around what would need to change around that, because I think the understanding is we'll need to do more work around value for money, full stop. So we'll come back to you.
Going forward, I would recommend that the person who brings the topic to ARAC will be Linda. Grant, you'll report on it as a statement of where things are. So I think it's Linda's responsibility to bring to ARAC for noting, so that ARAC are aware what the fees are being paid. Is that all right with you, Linda? Did you want to say anything else? Your hands up.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Thank you. The only other thing was I just wanted to, as Grant has finished now, clearly before anybody asks any questions, but as this is the final time, hopefully that this year's accounts will come through to the committee. I just wanted to sort of note our thanks really to Rachel and the finance team. We've got an unqualified, and Grant and the team really, but we've had a great year. We've had an unqualified audit, and the pressures on the team, well, both teams actually, to get this completed under the current circumstances have been immense. So just wanted to say thank you to them all.
I agree. Thank you, Linda. Tim, before I pass around the room for any questions, do you wish to comment? It may well be that you would rather have it under confidential, but since it's been raised in the letter at the bottom of page 61, where Grant makes reference to the ongoing investigation. You're on silent.
Sorry, I'm just looking for that.
It's on the value for money conclusion. So it's our pack, page 61. It says our discussion with officers, internal audit confirmed that there remains an external investigation there. It may be that we can't do anything other than just note that ARAC will be briefed confidentially as and when.
Yeah, David, what I propose then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have confidential reporting on some of these things from the next meeting. I suggest we pick it up at that point.
That's fine. I just didn't want to let it go without us referencing that we will update Eric on that later.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, can I throw the floor open to colleagues to see if there are any questions? Grant, you're lucky you got away with it. I'm going to be difficult and ask you the one question, which is obvious. Why so late? With the emphasis being on the word "so."
Yeah, no, and then just challenge us on that as well. I think the couple of reasons are COVID has just proved a challenge in just delivering the work. We've also had to wait to a certain extent on completion of the work from the companies. Now, one of that was completed in July, but some of that was a little bit later. So we were waiting for those assurances to come through. And then finally, and this, as I've said before, assurances from myself in respect of work carried out at the West Midlands Pension Fund. That got delayed, as a result of COVID. So I wouldn't say that's the primary why it's so late in terms of November. We will be working to complete our audit work earlier this year for 21-22. I'll be honest and say, depending on how quickly we can get the assurances, I can get the assurances completed at West Midlands Pension Fund. We may well still be in a position, I think, as a forward plan says, for June of 2021 to come to you and say, hopefully unqualified, except for this, if you know what I'm waiting on this piece of information. But I think that's the main reasons, and we're not quite sure what the timeline ultimately for local government would be this year. We're sort of assuming it's going to be end of July and into September again. But again, that MHC LG need to pass regulations for that to formally comply. So I think the main reasons are: one, COVID took longer. Took longer to complete your audit internally, but we were ready, as I say, in the summer. Issues in terms of COVID taking longer for assurances from the West Midlands Pension Fund auditor. They didn't arrive until mid-November, so I couldn't sign off until I'd received those. And then there were some issues around just, again, from COVID impacting, I think, on the audit on some of the audits of the companies. But those are sort of three main ones from my perspective.
Okay, thank you, Grant. Anything you want to add, Linda?
No, just to say we're already working with Grant and Helen on the plan, the detailed plan for completion. Hopefully a little bit more timely this time next year.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions? I just want to quickly check around the room. None. Thank you very much. Then I'm going to hand over to Victoria, who has the unenviable task of updating on the strategic risk register, which seems to be just full of risk. Victoria.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, and good morning to everyone. So the risk report and appended risk register has been circulated, of course, to all attendees with the meeting materials. And just a point to consider when reviewing that risk register is that the risk landscape for the combined authority is still continuing to be subject to significant levels of uncertainty caused by challenging economic conditions and the ongoing pandemic. And as such, all risks are subject to continuing close monitoring. Obviously, this situation is not exclusive to the combined authority, and many organisations are facing those same challenges. Really, I'd like to draw the committee's attention to 4 of the risks that sit within the register, 3 of which due to changes since the risk register last appeared in October before the committee, and the final one due to the level of uncertainty that really is impacting upon this risk. So firstly, risk detailed in S18, it previously sat on line 15 of the strategic risk register. This is around the COVID response, and it's now moved to the closed element of the risk register, not because the risk has fallen away, but because that's now merged into the risk detailed in S15 as the COVID element of that. And that can be seen on line 12 of the strategic risk register now. So it's not fallen away, but it's been merged with a previous risk. The second risk that has been subject to a level of change since its prior view before the committee, is risk S07F. This is currently sitting on line 23 of the risk register and is around delivery of for housing. So the risk score here has decreased from a prior score of 12 to 8, on the basis that the likelihood of the risk materialising has reduced following the introduction of some enhanced mitigants to that risk. So the likelihood has reduced from a 3 to a 2, causing that risk score to decrease. The next risk has had an increase in risk materiality, and that's risk S06, and you can see that on lines 14 and 15 of the risk register before you, line 15 being the COVID related impact. So the increase in residual risk score here is due to both likelihood and impact having increased based on challenging economic conditions. The risk obviously continues for those reasons to be subject to very close monitoring, and we continue to lobby government to support commercial operations impacted by the pandemic. And finally, risk S documented in S11, so that's visible in lines 5 and 6 of the register before you. So really, this risk already carries the most high level of materiality, with a score of 25 anyway. And really, I wanted to bring this to your attention due to the level of uncertainty with the regional impact due to COVID and Brexit. This remains subject to considerable levels of uncertainty, and as such, with all the other risks, is subject to close monitoring. And with your approval, Chair, I believe that Julia Goldsworthy may like to add a few brief words extra on this matter.
Thank you, Victoria. I was actually going to throw the baton to Julia. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think significant update since the report was put together and shared. Obviously, we've had a trade deal with the European Union, so that was a significant unknown risk, really, heading into our last conversation that we didn't know the outcome of. And what we're now doing is just, given that the worst case scenario hasn't played in, we do have a deal. What we're now doing is just working through the implications of that. Tim and I have been looking at the organisation implications and updating kind of the report that we prepared earlier on that. So, and then as Victoria said, on the broader COVID risk, what we've been trying to do is just to mainstream those risks into the others, given that it's kind of part of the backdrop of our operating context now, as well as being like a distinct event we need to engage with. So we just tried to make that a bit clearer.
Thank you, Julian. Any questions or points anybody wishes to raise? None that I can see. Victoria, Julia, hold on, I've got Ram.
Sorry, Chair, I think just the last point on the issue of Brexit apart. Is it likely to cost more? I'm just thinking, I know it's a bit of mess to control, sort out by all the people who are involved. I'm looking at the issue of cost. Is it going to increase our cost? Or the overall picture of cost, how it going to pan out with the combined authority?
Thanks very much. And I suppose this is just a good example where if you'd asked us a year ago, we would have said that Brexit was the biggest potential economic shock facing the region, and there would be implications for the combined authority. Actually, we're now in a world where the impact of, to what extent do we try to need to disentangle the, say, supply chain, key supply impacts of COVID from the ones from Brexit? So what we're just trying to do is understand the current consolidated position, just bearing in mind that both COVID and the kind of the fallout of the trade implications, it's not going to be a cliff edge. It's going to be a kind of case of working through when potential risks might crystallise. So I suppose, Councillor Lamb, what we are doing is just keeping a very, very close eye on that. We just recognise that is going to be an emerging picture. We know there are potential risks there, but it's difficult to predict exactly when they may play out and how they may play out.
So it's a manageable risk, rather, is it?
Yes.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, at present it's manageable, and we're continuing to monitor it closely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Victoria, Julia, thank you. Bearing in mind that the most important tool that ARAC has to try to fulfil its role is the Strategic Risk Register, and it's continued to be hugely uncertain. And in many senses, we've tried to accommodate that by not pressing too much for the level of detail and granularity. Are you content that this still is our best tool with which to oversee and provide governance, or is there a better way that we could do so in the current climate?
So I would say, I hope from an ARAC point of view, but also from an organisational point of view, it is a very important kind of reference point for us to get to be able to take the temperature on where the overall risks are in the organisation and where we should be focusing our attention on mitigating actions. Obviously, there is a huge amount of detail that sits underneath that and relates then down through into individual directorates and services. So I suppose the question for you, Chair, and for ARAC is, what is your appetite to kind of want to drill down into that further detail, or is this register giving you an adequate overview of kind of how that activity comes together?
Colleagues, any comment? I have a suggestion to make, but let me just check if anybody else has any thoughts. I can't see any. My suggestion, Julia, Victoria, is that for the June meeting, albeit that we'll have the annual accounts, I think we should do a real drains up on the Strategic Risk Register, understand what's underneath everything, for two reasons. One is that we'll have gone from pretty well nearly a year where uncertainty has been the order of the day, and by then we should start to be getting a bit more certainty. But also, I will be handing the chairmanship on to somebody, and I think it's deserving of ARAC for us to actually have a look at where we are and having like a public record of understanding the Strategic Risk Register in the current climate. Is that acceptable?
Yep, that's
fine.
That's fine.
Colleagues, are you all okay with making that agenda?
Yes, David, agree.
Thank you. Tanya, could you make sure that goes on the bring forward, please? Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you both. Can we move now to Fiona and the Programme and Project Management Framework? I'm going to hand to Tim at the end of that because I wanted Tim just to give us an update on something. But Fiona, you have the ball.
Very much, Chair. So the Programme and Project Management Framework, the audit was undertaken in the 2019-2020 financial year, and the recommendations made to ARAC in May last year. There were three amber issues, most of which would be met through the implementation of the single assurance framework. The paper really has a dual purpose. It's an update on progress made against those agreed recommendations through the rollout of the single assurance framework, but also to outline the enhanced appraisal and assurance tools together with a route map to reporting to ARAC. It's fair to say that considerable progress has been made against the implementation of the single assurance framework, and the focus really is on the benefits around aiming to align through a golden thread to make sure that the strategic objectives of the WMCA feed down through project and performance development. It provides a consistent and proportionate process, and also efficient governance process, and some of those legacy approvals have been removed. There are also improved controls around management, performance and benefits realisation. A number of processes and tools have been developed in a very collaborative and inclusive way. So my team, the Strategic Hub, have worked very well with the senior leadership team, with statutory officers and with directorates across the WMCA to make sure that those tools meet the needs of all directorates and the requirements that they might have from different government departments as well. So the paper does focus on the main touch points that projects and programmes have with the single assurance framework, and that's initiation, development and approval stages. So broadly, during a project life cycle, they're the main areas that we have focused in the audit recommendations. The approvals process went live in September last year, So the investment panel is now up and running, has met 5 times, and that is replacing TAP and IAG. The development stage is ready to roll out. So we have a suite of business case templates, guidance, and the appendices. And it was always the intention that we would initially transition the investment program projects into the single assurance framework using this suite of tools that meet the recommendations. And so Coventry projects were transitioned from September 2020, and we're working with Solihull to transfer all of their projects over. The initiation stage will be rolled out in line with the annual planning process from April. To go on to sort of a bit more focus on the assurance tools, an enhanced assurance offer has been developed, and that is aligned to the single assurance framework. And most of those tools will go live with the development stage when we have the business case templates, the new business case templates, and they're all detailed in 3.1 of the paper. The exception is the risk and investment appraisal. This has already been trialled, and we've worked well with colleagues in TFWM. And so for rail packages 1 and 2, and for the Dudley interchange, we have already used the risk and investment appraisal. And so we're able to see how that works in reality. It's not just a theoretical document. The intention is that as we develop business cases from Solihull, and as we develop business cases within the combined authority directorates, they will have a greater amount of trend analysis that we can present to ARAC. I think finally, whilst good progress has been made and there's an awful lot in flight, there's a lot of tools that have been developed and prepared, but we don't have the evidence, or we have limited evidence yet. And because we want to have a continuous improvement process, I would really welcome returning to ARAC in the spring to give a further update. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Fiona. Can I ask if there are any questions or anybody wishes to raise? Ram.
Thank you, Chair. Just to understand, actually, because this is working with the various projects, understand how it must be very complex to pull everybody together under one roof, rather, in a way. I understand that. I'm just trying to understand how probably Grant may be able to help us there. How, when they do the audit, external audit, how they manage those audits putting into this framework, and do they have separate audits and they wait for them, and how that actually impacts on this single framework issue in the end? Because this is a various other outside projects which are putting together. I'm just trying to understand how that works on the audit side. Thanks.
Yes, sorry, Chair, through you. In terms of, I think we'll need to consider how this works in terms of we tend to look at, I suppose, it in 2 arms. In terms of specific projects, we'll clearly audit any expenditure in the year, and we'll track that back to appropriate evidence. I think in terms of the programs themselves, we consider that more under the value for money approach, and we've been satisfied with arrangements to date. I think I was actually literally just making a note now that we need to get a bit more behind the changes for this year, because one of the elements that will change under the new value for money approach is we have to do what's now called an annual auditor's report, and we have to make a commentary on arrangements. It's not just a matter of us looking at risks and looking at the ones that the significant risks. So I think what you will get more from us this year is a commentary around this, which would hopefully then give you our view, an independent view of the arrangements and the assurance that the authority will get through them. So I think you'll probably see more in this year's review than you have done in the past around that.
Thank you, Grant.
Can I just ask further slightly? When Grant is saying running commentary on this, does that mean they will be looking at the audit reports on those projects separately, and then see how they fare on these issues, or is it separate work? I'm just trying to understand that.
Okay, I think we need to do a risk analysis around that. Where if we do believe there's an issue there that we need to look into, the commentary overall is when you receive our report, and there's still, I mean, I don't want to go too, I was going to more maybe in March around this, but in terms of the areas we need to look at, it's around governance, it's around economy efficiency and effectiveness, and around financial sustainability. So I would see this probably fitting into either governance or 3 E's. And then in the past, on our VFM, as you noted, we would just say, actually, we've looked across the authority, we believe this is a risk area, we need to focus on that. Whilst that still applies, we have to give a commentary though, and a more general commentary across the overall arrangements. And I think I'd need to look at how this has been settled in. So what I'm saying is you will get a view from us around whether we, you know, picking up on the work that internal audit have done, and et cetera, around whether I suppose the single framework is working or not. So I think that's what the commentary will look at. And part of that is we'll have to have conversations with Julia and Fiona, et cetera, and the team. It's not, I won't be making that up, if you know what I mean. It's we need to get a more detailed review of that going forward. So I think you will get more feedback from us as auditors, I suppose. And maybe in the past I'd go, actually, it's got good arrangements. We haven't identified anything going wrong, any particular risks. I wouldn't see that as being a risk area. Now I have to give more of a, why do I not think it's a risk area, effectively? Okay.
Thank you, Grant. Yes.
Okay, Grant, can you, in the March meeting, when you come and talk about the 4 plans, can you address that a little bit more substantially than you might have done otherwise, just to give members an understanding how you will, as opposed to how you think you might at the moment, address it? Thank you very much. Any other questions for Julia or Fiona? None. Can I raise one, Fiona? I think your suggestion of coming back in the spring is a good one. Can I suggest you come back at our April meeting? So not the next one, but the one after that, which is our standard April meeting, because a number of your actions are due to complete at the end of March or in April. And I think a quick update on how you're progressing is probably all we need, unless you think that you need to bring to our attention something else. ARAC had decided that in addition to internal audit, that your activity in this area required our full attention. And when you believed that something wasn't necessarily happening to the speed and the impetus that was necessary, it was left to you to come to us and ask for our involvement, if you like. So I think a quick update, unless you feel there's more than that in the April meeting.
I'd really welcome that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Anything anybody wishes to add? Are you okay with me asking for that? Good. All right. Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you, Julia. Julia, don't despair. I'd like you to just add your 10 pennyworth when Linda's doing her financial update. Linda, over to you.
Thank you. So we have a quick set of slides. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. It's a quick update on the financials. Both the latest financial position and the draft budget report were considered by the Combined Authority Board on Friday, and I just wanted to just give you a quick overview of the contents of both of them. And then obviously, as that slide says there, actually, and it's critical for us, obviously, the sustainability position financially beyond next financial year. So the 2021 in-year position then. So in the current year, the Combined Authority is managing a revenue budget of £311 million and a capital budget of £630 million. So that's, as it says there, set against a backdrop of the extraordinary challenges of the coronavirus pandemic. We are also delivering an ambitious business transformation programme that is aiming to deliver long-term savings for the Combined Authority in its way that it's governance and its administration. And we've also got additional work, obviously, that we're taking on board in terms of planning for the mayoral election, if that does indeed go ahead in May. So if we have the next slide. Where the slides have stuck. Thank you. Yeah, so our initial estimates at the early stages of the crisis, and we took an update report in June to the board, suggested that we could be facing as large a variance in year as around £11 million on the revenue budget. Primarily driven by transport-related income drops as a consequence of the pandemic and the restrictions introduced to limit the spread of the virus. So that was around us additional costs that we're experiencing in regards to the cost of bus services provision, where obviously on our subsidised bus network to maintain the required capacity, volume and capacity, we would have put on more services to be able to have social distancing in place. And then secondly, we were seeing losses in significantly around the metro operations, as well as losses in other income, operational and investment income returns. So at the time we thought it was going to be as big as 11 million, and we're also beginning to see financial impact of the pandemic relating to disruption in the transport capital programme. A couple of things have been sort of delayed slightly, nothing of any great significance as yet. The Midland Metro Alliance did close very briefly, but then mobilised very quickly in a safe and secure way, which has meant that actually a lot of the work we've sort of taken advantage of the lockdown, if you like, and actually continued and progressed at pace a lot of the capital programme work. But we are starting to see tender price increases coming through the system. So it's one we're just monitoring on a close basis. So urgent mitigating actions that we took as a senior leadership team. So we reviewed all of the staffing and recruitment activity and ensured that we put in place visibility of that through the senior leadership team and statutory officers to ensure that we were only recruiting to urgently required posts. We've undertaken a detailed review of all discretionary spending. So we set up a board called the Productivity and Efficiencies Board. That's an internal officer group chaired by myself to specifically target what it says on the can, really, productivity and efficiencies from the day-to-day management and operations of the combined authority in terms of its administration. And we conducted a review of the reprioritisation exercise on the balance sheet reserves, just to see whether or not I could repurpose or release any one-off resources in order to be able to meet that potential deficit in year. So if we have the next slide, so the November 20 position. So that was the year-to-date position at the end of November went to the January board. Last Friday. I'm now pleased to actually report that we are forecasting a saving of £1 million. Now that's moved, it hasn't just suddenly gone from 11 million to 1 million. We've been taking reports all the way through. So we took a report to July board, we took a report to November board, where the situation has got progressively better during the year, and I'm very pleased to say that we're now looking to be in a surplus position of £1 million. Now actually what that does, that period of things getting better for us, is that we've had improved transport income forecasts. So actually we found that the patronage on, particularly around metro, won't say the same for bus and rail, but particularly on metro, had recovered quicker than we thought. But what we have been able to do is we have secured a what's called a light rail grant. So essentially what's happening is that the Department for Transport are actually giving us, making good all of our losses on light rail. So all of our losses, income losses on light rail, and all of our additional costs for providing extra bus services are being funded and fully underwritten by the government. That process is in place on an ongoing basis, and we've certainly got that now. The biggest change that's happened recently is that they've extended that to March. So the whole year has been covered by government in terms of that underwrite. We've also been able to claim reimbursement for lost sales fees and charges income from government. So all of your local authorities will be able to be doing that, but they also confirm that mayoral combined authorities could claim that. So we're clearly covered through to the end of March on well, I think they've said to the end of April now, but covered on any lost income from sales fees and charges. We have had some savings on concessionary travel costs. That's not as a result of the specific as the pandemic, because what we've been doing is we've been paying the bus industry at pre-COVID demand levels as required by government, but we were seeing a decline in the concessionary travel budget anyway, and we've rescheduled some of our life cycle costs. So when I say life cycle, it's like ongoing maintenance costs around the metro. So actually we've sort of reprioritised and rag rated a lot of the metro maintenance and renewal costs just to make sure that they remain affordable. And then we've delivered several quite a few discretionary expenditure savings across the portfolios, and not least the Productivity and Efficiencies Board work has generated something like £300,000 or £400,000 savings this year. Those favourable positions partly offset by a reduction in our investment income received as a reduction in the bank rate at the start of the crisis. That is not something that we're allowed to claim back from government, so that has been a financial impact on us. But as I say, we're there or thereabouts in terms of this year, in terms of a position that's been recovered. So I'm really pleased with that. If we have the next slide. So this financial year is okay, on track. For budget setting then, we've managed to present a balanced budget to the Combined Authority Board for the 21-22 financial year on Friday. So the key headlines in that draft budget were that we have managed to protect all existing policies and services at no extra cost to the constituent authorities. So there'll be no increase in constituent or non-constituent fees or the transport levy for 21-22. We have factored in the significant savings from the business transformation work and the productivity and efficiency savings. So that's delivered as a £1 million worth of savings for next year, sorry, ongoing. Key to notice, there's no mayoral precept for the remainder of the mayor's electoral term. And the report also provided a draft capital delivery plan for the authority, and that's estimating that we'll deliver just over £600 million worth of capital investment next year. The final budget report will go to the Combined Authority Board in February, but I'm pleased to say that the budget report on Friday as a draft was accepted by the board. So what we have done is I haven't been able to achieve a balanced budget without there being some risks in there. So we've had discussions with leaders all the way through, right from sort of as soon as the pandemic started, through every Met leader and mayor liaison session in terms of managing the financial position. They are, I can't say they're not happy, but that they are eyes wide open in terms of the risks that we are facing in terms of next financial year. What we have done is assume that it's assumed recovery of patronage levels across all modes of transport, or that actually if we continue to see a reduction as a result of the pandemic, then that government will continue to underwrite that. And I think the dialogue that I'm having with government, both CLG and DFT, the levels of engagement are very high. Their levels of understanding of the risks that we're facing is very high, and they are actively, and I mean really actively, in discussions with us about continuing to ensure that the transport services are protected. So whilst it is a risk, we are in active engagement with that, and as I've said, we have got assurance that government funding will continue until at least the end of March. I think from a buzz perspective, they are looking to at least continue to fund the impact on buses until the end of any emergency measures. But what we are seeing is a significant instability in the bus industry, in the bus market, given the patronage losses on the bus market and the commercial bus market. Government again has been stepping in all the way through this pandemic in terms of support to the bus industry. In that budget is it doesn't provide any assumptions regarding any deterioration in the commercial network next year. So again, we are assuming that the government will continue to support the bus industry, and whilst they are doing that, that means that the bus network and the bus industry will continue to provide the commercial services that it does at the minute. But any lack of support into the bus industry could destabilise the bus market, and it may mean that we find ourselves faced where the bus market actually deregisters some of its commercial services, which means we haven't got a fully covered network. And at that point, it would trigger into our subsidised bus service provision, and may mean that we would have to step in order to maintain our policy. That could be up to anywhere up to what between nothing and £40 million is our estimate based on sector informed analysis. But there, as I say, the assurance at this point is that that there is no indication from government that they will not be continuing to fund that whilst emergency measures are in place. But it is just a risk. If we have the next slide. So what we've got is some residual risks in the budget there. You can see we've got potentially we could have COVID-19 driven increases in the subsidised bus service capacity requirements that may or may not continue to be funded by government, but we are assuming that they will continue. The fares losses from Metro, again, we are assuming that they've been funding them all the way to March. So we're assuming that whilst emergency measures are in place, they will continue to fund them. And that has two impacts. It has an impact on how much income I actually lose, but it also actually impacts the level of borrowing I can do to fund renewals based on future fares. So we think that inherent in that budget, there is a considerable risk. We have no usable reserves other than, sorry, that's not true. We have £240 million worth of usable reserves. However, the majority of those reserves are allocated to the investment programme, and they arise from the gain share grant. And now that's actually fully allocated to the investment programme, generating the 801 million capital buying power. So what we reported to board, and what everybody we've discussed at length with leaders, is that any realisation of the risk of that magnitude that's being driven obviously by the ongoing pandemic impact on transport would require us to undertake an emergency budget exercise during next year, and potentially to mitigate the use of that by use of reserves earmarked for the investment programme. So it may mean that actually we go through next year and have to reprioritise the investment programme. But that is the absolute sort of plan B emergency contingency. At the minute, we are comfortable that we have got a balanced budget. So overall 21-22 position, so we've had significant work's been undertaken with the Mayor and the leaders to reaffirm the plans and priorities and particularly protect the transport services and the transport policies. Proposed mitigating actions will allow for a balanced budget to be presented, which allows the CA to meet its deliverables. We are underwriting next year's budget with £3.9 million worth of reserves. Now, again, we've discussed this with Grant, but that is not a sustainable solution in any way, shape or form. But actually, we recognise that we can only set a one-year budget. This is not a situation that is special to the combined authority. This is an issue that is facing all local authorities nationally in terms of the uncertainty around their financials. But we are very clear in the report that was taken to board that a sustainable funding model is required to be identified for next year. So sustainable funding beyond next year. So we've taken the mitigating actions to close the funding gap. We are reliant on ad hoc central government funding, and we are constantly reviewing our levels of spend based on short-term availability. Some general fund reserves remain, but they are not sufficient to sort of continue to plug and limp through the annual budgeting process. We have already utilised earmark reserves, but if we did have to use more of those earmark reserves, as I've said earlier, we would have to make changes to commitments already made. So in order for us to effectively plan, we need to constantly deliver on a value for money basis. A sustainable funding route for transport and mayoral combined authorities must be agreed and actioned within the next financial year, and that's something we are actively talking to CLG on. I think that was it. That's all I was going to say. Obviously, we are looking at opportunities in terms of and Julia will just touch on this now, we're looking at all the opportunities that will present itself from the recent government announcement, and we've input from a regional perspective into the 3rd of March budget. And we are openly already engaged, as I said, through CLG in regards to what we and how we feed into the CSR. But Julia, I don't know whether you want to add anything on the back of that.
As Linda said, there's been pretty intense discussion with the financials with central government, but more broadly, we're also engaging collectively from a local economy recovery group point of view with a number of mayoral combined authorities, cities, local authorities. So there's a route there to talk about broader economic recovery as a cohort through the M9, which is kind of the group of mayoral combined authorities, as well as on an individual basis. What I would say is that kind of some processes are those set piece processes are continuing as expected. So as Linda mentioned, just prior to Christmas, the Treasury confirmed that there would be a budget on the 3rd of March this year. So submissions to that went in last week. So that's a process that's continuing as normal, albeit against that kind of very difficult financial backdrop. But there are other processes which continue to be kind of a bit of a movable feast, more uncertain. So we still don't have clarity on the devolution white paper, when that might be coming. Last year's spending review was expected to be a multi-year capital and revenue settlement that was kind of deferred to a rollover. We're still working through kind of what we expect from a spending review this year. So it was billed as an autumn event, but I suspect that the backdrop to the March budget has probably changed even from the point at which the Chancellor firmed up the date before Christmas. I think it's quite likely we might have a spending review in the summer rather than in the autumn. So we just need to monitor that very carefully. In terms of broader recovery activity on our own part, we're continuing to prepare the ground as best as we can. So the community recovery paper for the region went to CA board last week. We're continuing to work through our economic recovery planning processes, but again, just the context in which we're developing those is changing. So as Ed Cox said at CA board last week, you know, we've got the plans, but we're not really in a position to mobilise them given this, where we are with the pandemic now. Similarly, with the economic piece, we're doing a lessons learned piece over the last 12 months at the moment, but we'll kind of be producing that into a different context of what we were expecting when we put this in place. But we just need to make sure we're adapting that material accordingly. And similarly, that means just that the engagement with government is different as well. There's still a lot of focus on the kind of day-to-day management of the pandemic, really, rather than some of these longer-term recovery issues. But what we are doing is just making sure that we're as ready as we can be for those conversations when it's the appropriate time to start mobilising them.
Thank you, Julia. I commend the paper that was also circulated, which was a piece of work by Julia or her team on the spending review briefing. I think that gave quite an insight, but I suspect was out of date within 24 hours of being produced. Right, any questions, anybody? That was quite a detailed briefing, probably a lot of it of interest to you in your wider area. Ahmed, I think you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to Linda and Julia for that very useful briefing. An anxiety I do have, and I wonder if there's any clarity on this as of yet, is whether any funding has been allocated by central government for the mayoral election. I know this came up at another committee about a month or so ago, and the position was then that no, nothing had come back from government, but I just wondered where we are in terms of that. And just a brief comment, it's reassuring to hear that conversations with government are going well. I think that filling of the gap will be really, really important, certainly as long as measures are in place. And I would also hope that even after that, as we still continue to feel the economic ramifications of COVID-19. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ahmed. Linda, did you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, so we are still in dialogue with government with regards to the funding of the mayoral election. We have very late last week been given an indication from CLG as to where they will expect the majority of costs to come from, and I've got to have a conversation with the West Midlands finance directors just to bottom that out, essentially, because it will be coming from one of the existing pots that they've allocated. Yeah, it's ongoing. The dialogue's ongoing. We are feeding through, as a finance directors M9 group, we are feeding through nationally into the mayor's M9 group to continue to lobby government for the full amount. That said, you would expect me to do, that we will need to have contingency set aside just in case that funding in full doesn't materialise. But it's an ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Linda. Ahmed, do you want to follow through?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to Linda for that. I am concerned that at the moment the situation is that I don't ask you to obviously go into detail, but I am concerned that they're currently asking the combined authority to draw upon an existing pot of money. I don't know what the situation's been like previously, forgive me, but I would imagine that at the previous mayor election that the government would cover the costs, and I'm just wondering whether moving forward, if we are required to use existing pots of money, whether there could be an assessment given to this committee as to whether that would have any ramifications on any existing responsibilities and liabilities that the combined authority has. Because as Linda says, and I totally agree, that obviously the preferred position would be that government meets the full cost of the election. And if it doesn't, then I would be concerned about any financial risks that the combined authority faces, especially considering the funding constraints and uncertainties that we have at the moment, exacerbated, of course, by COVID-19. But that would be all for now. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, no, apologies. So when the indication from government is that they would need us to seek it from a pot of money that they have, an additional pot of money that they have set aside for, so not existing funds, but additional COVID funds that they've allocated. So that's a conversation we just need to bottom out where that money is, if you like, in terms of the what pot of money it's come through in terms of the CLG money, the CLG additional COVID funding that's been come through into the region. But happy to give an update and keep this as a sort of, I'll give an update on this next time we meet, just to see where we are.
Thank you. I'll take that as that suggestion, Linda, and I think it's going to be a topical subject. So if you could bring it back at March for a quick verbal update, that would be helpful. Yeah. Are you okay with that, Ahmed? All right, I shall take that as a yes. Right, any other questions? Right, thank you both very much for that. Let me move on to Carl and the Treasury Management Policy. Carl?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. As Linda mentioned in the previous presentation, the Combined Authority will have a combined revenue capital budget next year of around about £960 million. It will be the Treasury Management Policy and the Treasury Management Strategy that will govern how WMCA manage all of its borrowing and investments that underpin that activity next year. The strategy and policy will be presented to WMCA Board on the 12th of February for final approval. But in doing so, ARAC have agreed to review and endorse the strategy in line with CIPFA Code recommendations. As requested by ARAC in September, I'm joined today by Mark and Amar from Arlene Close. They are our independent Treasury Management advisors, and Mark and Amar have a short presentation for ARAC just to give an overview of the Treasury Management environment to help ARAC provide the necessary assurance before WMCA Board.
Thank you very much. Before Mark and Anna actually say anything, I did suggest to Carl that he included all of the papers, most of which I think are not going to be of any relevance to most of you, but there were one or two financial gurus within the team, and I decided to have them included just in case anybody wanted to peruse them. So don't feel that you've let the side down if not everybody's read it in detail, and nobody's going to ask any questions. Okay, over to Mark and Anna.
Thank you. Good morning. I'll just begin by sharing my screen. So hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So thanks for this time this morning. Mark and I will be going through a quick presentation on Treasury management. So just to give you an overview of what we'll be looking at, I will begin with looking at, well, what is Treasury management and the legislation, guidance and roles and responsibilities that comes with that. I'll then pass on to Mark to look at the economic outlook and credit conditions. And then we'll bring things back to a local level, looking at the authorities' borrowing and investment strategies. So without further ado, I'll kick off. Well, what is Treasury management? So the authority will have receipts coming in. For example, we'll have grants and precepts coming in, and then also payments going out in the form of employee salaries and paying for goods and services. But of course, there'll be some timing differences between these receipts coming in and payments going out, and that creates a cash flow for the authority. Sometimes the authority may be in positions where there is a surplus in liquidity, and sometimes a deficit in liquidity. And this will enable us to understand whether the authority is in either a net investment position or a net borrowing position. So moving forward, so what are the key principles of treasury management for a combined authority? Well, when we're looking at the investment strategy, it's ensuring that security is the primary focus. So what does that actually mean? Well, ensuring that the investment made, whether it be a deposit with a bank, ensuring that that is secure and you're receiving back the principal amount invested, as well as the interest agreed as well. After that comes liquidity. We want to be positive that the amount that we're investing, we can call upon it when we believe so and when is agreed with the terms. And then finally, commensurate to the security and liquidity comes the yield. And then flipping things around, when we're looking at the borrowing strategy, well, ensuring that any borrowing undertaken is prudent, it's affordable to the authority, and finally, it's sustainable over the longer term as well. So this is a sort of a brief overview of the key principles when we're looking at the two strategies outlined here. Well, what is our approach? So Arlene Close are the authority's treasury management advisors. So how do we form our views and recommendations to the authority? Well, we start off by looking at the balance sheet. So we'll look at the cash flow requirements going forward and project these for the longer term with officers' help. And in hand with this, we'll also look at market interest rates, and together we'll use both of these to form our advice. We'll also look at current portfolios for both investments and debt, and we'll show this going forward within this presentation. And we use all of this information to form a strategy and to develop this and implement this into future decisions made by the authority. We also have an ongoing approach of measuring success. So we'll do this through things like investment benchmarking and debt benchmarking, and showing where the authority sits in comparison to its peers, to ensure that strategies going forward and any future decisions are continuing to improve. That's a very quick look at our approach. And here we've got an overview of the legislation, the guidance and the roles and responsibilities that come with each different committee and the boards within the authority. So, for example, when looking at legislation for local government, the Local Government Act 2003 states that authorities must set a affordable borrowing limit. So that's one thing that comes out of the legislation, which we know that must be done each year, and also to have regard for any guidance set out For example, statutory guidance set out by SIPFA, who are the accounting body for local government, and then also MHCLG, so who sets the investment guidance and the debt guidance as well, as outlined in that second graphic there. And finally, any roles and responsibilities that come with each role, for example, for the audit committee, who must receive and act on the audit reports, so using meetings such as this to review the policies and the strategies put in place, for example, the Treasury management strategy, which will be undertaken, and then finally making recommendations to the board and using sessions such as this to scrutinise any of these reports and make recommendations for improvements. We have got more detail on this slide at the back of the pack in the appendix, so we'll send this around for everybody to read after this session as well for any more detail that you require. I'll pass over to Mark now, who will have a look at the economic and credit conditions.
Thank you, Emma. So if you can move forward, please, to slide 7. Of course, the Treasury management activities of the authority don't happen in a vacuum, and the global picture and economic sentiment is a really important backdrop to what's going on. Quite clearly, the year we've just had has been momentous, and it's reflected quite clearly, we feel, on this chart, which shows 3 lines: the Dow Jones index in green there at the top, and then 2 UK stock indices, the FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 in red and blue respectively. And you can see quite how far those indices fell in the early part of March through towards the end of March in 2020, as the pandemic gripped not just China but moved to Italy, and it became clear this was going to be a global problem. However, since then there's been a really very dramatic recovery, especially in the US, who haven't had Brexit distraction, but also in the UK, and beyond the recent announcement of a deal, if only a thin deal, the FTSE has continued to recover. So the economic backdrop has been one of a great deal of volatility. However, there is a good deal of optimism now as we stand at the beginning of 2021. And if we move over now, please, Amar, to look at the credit situation on page 8. The Combined Authority is, of course, managing money as part of its cash flow that Amar alluded to on the earlier slide, and the local authority has to find somewhere that is secure to place those funds. That means that it may be exposed to banks, and in order to assess the credit strength, i.e. the likelihood of you recovering your funds from a bank, we need to look at some metrics, and we can look at many. We could look at share prices, we could look at the price of bonds issued by banks, we can look at credit ratings, but we find them rather backward looking. And one of the issues we look at is called CDS, which is credit default swaps. And a credit default swap sounds rather complicated, but in fact it isn't. A credit default swap is very simply an insurance policy against the risk of a bank going bust. And what this chart shows us is that the cost of those insurance policies ballooned during March and April of 2020, again, as the coronavirus pandemic gripped, but that over the course of 2020 and into early 2021, those premiums have dripped away. And so Barclays, Santander, NatWest, Nationwide, Lloyds, HSBC and Standard Chartered are the banks that are represented on here. The premiums on those insurance policies have reached the sorts of levels that we would have seen during more benign times in 2019. And so we're relatively relaxed, actually, about credit risk at this point in time. Moving on, please, Amar. We're also going to take a very quick look now at what the Bank of England's outlook, unfortunately back in November, because we don't yet have the February monetary policy report, but the Bank of England's view. So this is independent of our own, but we thought it had merits in explaining. So we have 3 fan charts here. The fan is the area of uncertainty on the right-hand side of each of these pages. The darker the colour in each of these charts, the more certain the bank are of the outcome. And if we start with the left-hand chart, which is displayed in green, this is the Bank of England's outlook for GDP, gross domestic product. That's the way in which we measure the size of the economy. And you can see we had a very sharp dip again because of the first lockdown, and the Bank of England in November had begun to forecast a mini dip towards the end of this year. But in November, we didn't know that we were going to be moving to full lockdown during early 2021. And so we feel that it's likely actually that the dip is rather deeper than is indicated by this chart, and that recovery may be a bit stronger actually. So a deeper dip as the second wave hits, but a faster recovery on the other side. The outlook for unemployment. Again, in November, the bank didn't know about the further extension to the job retention scheme, furlough, and so it was anticipating that unemployment would rise to in excess of 7%, perhaps as high as 8% in the early part of 2021. And at the moment, unemployment is nowhere near that because of the success, if you like, of the job retention scheme, and recovery taking place thereafter, seeing unemployment fall back to the sorts of levels we were seeing in 2018, 2019 by late 2023. The outlook for inflation is that we're in a bit of a soggy bottom at the moment, and then gradually recovering to the inflation target of 2% over the course of the next 3 years. And this tells us that the bank, whose primary mandate is the control of CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation, to 2%, the bank doesn't feel it needs to move interest rates anytime soon. And indeed, if we move over now, Amar, to our final page on the economic outlook, we have two charts here. The red line on the official bank rate, that's base rate chart on the left, there is Arlingclo's own forecast. We're forecasting that base rate is left on hold at 0.1% throughout the next 3 years. The pink area around that is our risk scenarios, and the grey line that tracks below our own is the market's implied forecast for interest rates over that same period. You'll note that the market has actually priced the risk of rates turning negative at some point later in 2021. Now, base rate is important for the authority in two respects. One, the investments that you make tend to be relatively short dated, and therefore they're exposed to that interest rate risk, the risk that rates go negative. And it's also important because if the authority were to undertake more borrowing to fund its capital programme, it would likely do some of this for short periods from other local authorities, for instance, and therefore be exposed to borrowing costs, which are priced close to base rate. On the right-hand side of the chart, we've got our forecast for 20-year gilt yields. These are important not from an investment point of view, but because when local authorities borrow from the Public Works Loan Board, which is an agency of government, part of the Debt Management Office, you borrow at 80 basis points typically over gilt yields. So if gilt yields at the moment are about 0.7% for 20 years, you would borrow at 1.5% for 20 years from the Public Works Loan Board. And we're anticipating that that rate will edge up ever so. Sorry, I think someone's phone might be ringing. That rate may edge up ever so slightly over the course of the next 3 years. So we're not too worried about missing an opportunity to borrow at very low rates for the long term. So rates really very stable in our view over the medium term. Amar, if we could just move on to the next chart just to address that point of negative interest rates. So on this chart, what we're tracking is the implied probability of rates being cut. So this is measuring the market's view of whether rates will be cut or not. One cut is a cut of 0.1%. That would take base rate to 0. And you can see that the market's implication is that the red line crosses that dotted 100% chance in around September of 2021 before going beyond it, implying negative rates. So for the short term, over the period of the summer, it looks like both ourselves and the market are reasonably comfortable that the authority won't be exposed to negative rates. And Amar will talk about the size of the portfolio later and how important this might be. But there is a risk of negative rates in the distant future. We don't feel it will materialise. We think the Bank of England have been giving some relatively strong signals that it won't happen. But we are working on ways to mitigate the impact of negative rates should they come to pass. If we move on from page 11 as well, Amar, we're going to look at just borrowing strategy, and on page 13, please. Here we have a chart and a table. The table at the bottom just summarises the current borrowing position of the authority. I think the table is more instructive. The blue line on that chart represents something called your capital financing requirement. That's essentially illustrates your capital aspirations, the things that you want to build and that you will have to pay for over time. And your CFR rises as you build those assets and then begins to fall as you make payments over time to reduce that burden. And the red line indicates what we call your liability benchmark, which is the minimum amount of debt that you can get away with in order to deliver that. The gap between the blue line and the red line is funded by the fact that you have balances and reserves and working capital surpluses. And those mean that you can choose not to borrow that element. Effectively, you can internally borrow that. It's like an offset mortgage arrangement. Therefore, anywhere the red line exceeds the grey area, which is your existing debt portfolio, that indicates a borrowing requirement. And here it looks like you have a borrowing requirement which peaks at about 800 million and is, matures by about 2045. So long-term borrowing in your case would be perhaps for the next 24 years, and you need to get from the current debt portfolio level up to that 800 million or so level. So it's maybe a 650 million pound loan if you were to deliver all of your capital program in full on time. And our mantra at Arling Close is that you should only really borrow what you need when you need it, because the most expensive mistake you can make in treasury management, we feel, is borrowing money in advance of need, having to find somewhere safe to put it, and having to endure the cost of carry whilst doing that. And we said you could borrow 20-year money at 1.5% or so, but if you then have to invest it at 0, it's costing you 1.5% all the while that you're not using it. So we like to wait until the need crystallizes. And Amar, if you could just move on further slide from there, please. There has been a fairly significant change of late to the borrowing landscape. This chart shows you borrowing activity from UK local authorities on the bars across the page from July 2019 through to December 2020. You can see that there's a great deal of borrowing being undertaken in the latter part of 2019 before that red line and the blue trailing average jump in October of 2019 when the Public Works Loan Board increased the margin on Public Works Loan Board borrowing from 0.8% to 1.8% and effectively killed off any appetite that there might have been for borrowing, other than in March of 2020 when people borrowed because of fears about coronavirus and shortages of cash. You'll see on the right-hand side that we've had that red line tumble down the cliff again as the Public Works Loan Board consultation has been completed, and you're now able to access funds from the Public Works Loan Board again at 0.8% over gilts, which has brought us to see the red line, which represents 30-year Public Works Loan Board, hit all-time lows there on the right-hand side of the page. I'm going to hand back, I think, Amar now to Amar now to complete the slides with a look at the investment position of the authority.
Thanks, Mark. So I will wrap up with looking at the combined authorities investment. So if we just focus on the right-hand side to begin with, the pie chart shows the authority's current investments, which total around £200 million, and this is split between around £56 million in unsecured bank deposits. We've got a small sliver in money market funds, which is shown in that pink segment under funds unsecured, and then predominantly the majority of the investment balance is in the government section of £134 million, and that refers to deposits with other local authorities. So on the left-hand side, we are showing the approved investment counterparties and limits set by the combined authority, and all of the investments within the current portfolio are compliant with these limits and have been approved. So you can see from the left-hand side, the authority sets both time and monetary limits on all of the counterparties that it invests with, and then additional investment limits are also set for grouped funds as well, and limits such as country limits, sector limits, etc. So these are all broken down within the Treasury Management Strategy Statement and ensures that all investments made are compliant with the parameters outlined here. And I believe that takes us to the end of our presentation. So if there was any questions, Mark and I would be happy to answer. And as mentioned earlier, we'll be circulating these slides as well.
Mark, Amal, thank you very much. A really enlightening presentation. I think it will have helped a lot. Can I throw the floor open? Does anybody have any questions or points they want to make? Ram?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it is very interesting and good to understand some of it. I don't understand always money, but it's nice to have some kind of understanding. On the last but one slide, there was the issue of public service loan board was coming down. Is that because of the latest? I'm not sure whether it's because of new restrictions where that can be spent now, because they in the spending review they changed the goalpost, what you can borrow it for and how it can be spent. I'm just trying to understand whether that's the impact or just there's another part of the impact on it. Thank you.
That's correct, Councillor. The change came about at the end of a consultation that the Public Works Loan Board undertook, and essentially there is a limitation now on local authorities' ability to borrow money to invest for yield. So they cannot, in the terms of the guidance, purchase investment assets primarily for yield anymore. So the kind of activity which some local authorities have undertaken, buying a shopping centre several hundred miles from your own economic area, or buying a solar farm several hundred miles away, that's not going to be permitted anymore with borrowing that's undertaken for the Public Works Loan Board. Doesn't mean that you can't necessarily do it. You could do it, but you'd have to borrow from another source. And we think that's not likely to be relevant really to the combined authority. The combined authority's borrowing is very much to do with the delivery of infrastructure, which won't be caught out by those rules.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to also check whether whether Arak's two finance gurus, Sean and Alex, whether you have any particular questions or points you want to raise.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have any comments particularly. I just wonder whether it might be beneficial for the members of the committee for an explanation as to why negative interest rates would be such a bad thing.
I don't think we feel that there's necessarily a bad thing. I think, for an authority that needs to borrow a great deal of money over the next few years, if it does deliver its capital programme, negative rates could be a bit of a win because that means lots of cheap financing. However, the money that you're holding from month to month for payroll, whilst it's in a bank account or in a money market fund, perhaps potentially earning a negative rate of interest, that clearly causes a problem because it's an added cost to the running of the organisation. So it's not a huge concern in the great scheme of things. And what's the difference between earning 2 basis points in a bank account and earning -2 basis points in a bank account? It's no different than earning 8 basis points in a bank account or 4 basis points in a bank account. It's just a movement of a 4 basis point return. Psychologically, though, it's very important, we feel. So it's a risk, but it's not one that's not manageable for the authority.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Sean, are you okay with that?
Chair. Yeah. Chair.
Alex, yes, sorry.
Yes, so I'm going to go completely the opposite way there. Well, basically, there's a lot of mention about negative interest rates that we're not pricing anything changing. But as I'm, sure presenters aware, there's been a massive expansion in the monetary base. There is the push to continue fiscal policy to be fairly lax. Those are inflationary pressures. Now, Chair, some of us, including myself, are just old enough to remember double-digit inflation. So I'm just wondering if also at the same time we could look at negative rates, whether we could assume maybe not double-digit, but certainly rates which are there in a relatively low inflation environment. Rates going back up to 4-5%, inflation up at 3 or 4, which is after all what we had in a low inflation environment between 92 and 2008. My concern, it's not for us, but just generally on the markets, is those kind of risks of not necessarily that high historically, but higher rates than we've been used, have been underpriced in the market. And I think it's a fair old tail risk that we should be factoring in.
Thank you for those points. Yeah, I can remember double-digit interest rates too, just about. So with you on that one. I think conditions are rather different than textbooks on economics would have you sort of understand. If you took a textbook from 15, 20 years ago and suggested that you expand the monetary base and automatically you get inflation. Clearly, we didn't get that round of inflation that you might have expected from QE 1, 2 or 3, and we're now in QE 4, so quantitative easing, the printing of money in effect to buy back government bonds. the money isn't really leaking into the real economy. It is a little bit more this time round because perhaps some more targeted benefits through things like the job retention scheme have been put in place. But most of the money that's been printed is being used to just buy back government debt. So it's a financialisation, if you like. It's not really an increase in the supply of money in the real economy, and therefore more money chasing the same amount of goods generates inflation. So I don't think we're particularly concerned about inflationary pressures in the near term, other than perhaps in asset values. Which is a problem which sort of surfaced with QE 1, 2 and 3, and which we still have the hangover of, and that's that people who own houses have done very well out of QE in a sense, because the value of houses are carrying on going up and up and up and up and up. So the people who have assets continue to do relatively well in a quantitative easing type environment, and those who don't have assets, unfortunately, continue to find themselves priced out of markets. So I don't think there aren't some toxic side effects of the quantitative easing that we're seeing, but I don't necessarily see them as being inflation. And even if we were to get inflation, we believe that the Bank of England would look through the inflation in the near term, as it did back in 2008-9 and 2012-13, when we saw inflation spike to over 5% in two instances. And they chose that, although that they were 2% above the upper end of their target range, just to look through that and to leave rates on hold at 0.5% at that time. And I believe they'd do the same at the moment were we to experience any inflationary spike in the not too distant future. I think they're so concerned about getting the real economy growing again that it's a case of lower rates for the medium term. So for the duration of the next strategy that you'll consider probably in around February, which will see you through the year to the end of March 2022, I don't think higher rates is too much of a threat. As you saw from our 20-year projection, we don't think really there's much likelihood of longer rates rising very much over the course of the next 3 years, and the market agrees with us on that. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll come to pass, of course. So it's right to consider the risk of higher rates. And that's why I guess, I mentioned earlier, if you were to undertake some borrowing, some of it might be at short-term rates and some might be at long-term rates, but don't do the borrowing until you've actually got shovels in the ground and you're needing to make payments on that. So yeah, as we get closer and things become a bit clearer, there may be an increasing threat of higher rates, but we don't see it. And with governments that have issued so much debt, that debt needs to remain affordable almost for governments to remain viable and therefore to be able to service that debt. So there's a bit of a circularity about the argument of quantitative easing, huge amounts of government debt and those stimulus. So it's a fascinating area, I think. But yeah, we could probably go on for hours, Alex, if we wanted to. So it is a threat. It's worth thinking about, but we don't think it's clear at present.
We couldn't attempt to chair. I won't. It just reminds me of the quote by leisure investor Mark Faber on quantitative easing. It's a policy by rich people for rich people to increase the price of their Warhols. And I'll leave it at that.
I think I would actually, Alex. Thank you very much. Right, just let me throw the opportunity for Carl if you wish to say anything more. Otherwise, I'll close the subject. Carl?
Thanks, Chair. I think I'm happy with the input from Arlene Close. I haven't got anything else to add on that basis. Thank you.
Can I congratulate Mark and Emma? I think that was a really very good presentation and would help us all enormously. I'm going to summarise then. We've had put to us in the paperwork an understanding what the strategy is for Treasury management. We've had Arlene Close give us the background, and whilst it's not their job to tell us that they are comfortable with this, I think they are largely saying with evidence that they are comfortable with the line that we're taking. I'd like everybody's permission, therefore, for us to record that we are content with the strategy and the evidence that we've got at the moment as to where Treasury management is.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We'll then I'll move the subject on. We have a paper which I think is very self-explanatory from Tim regarding the arrangements of the mayoral election, which I suspect may well be teetering on the being out of date with regard to what's happening with government. I don't propose, because of time, to ask Tim to talk to us at the moment, because I think it's self-explanatory. Unless anybody has a specific question, what I'd like to do is to ask Tim to update us verbally at the next meeting, when we should have a much better idea what's happening with regard to the mayoral election, with government having made a decision by them. Are there any questions to Tim's paper? That's none. Tim, are you content for me to take that as accepted, but for us to have an update at the March meeting?
Chair, that's absolutely fine. As you say, there is some uncertainty, and Linda mentioned this as well. We're continuing to liaise with central government over the possibility of whether or not the elections might be postponed, but we will advise you as soon as possible, obviously, and I can comment on it in March. With your permission, Chair, I just wondered whether I could just say, you may have seen the comment in the chat a little while ago that we are core now. Unfortunately, the system for some reason today isn't telling us when people joined the meeting, so it's slightly unclear when we became core. But we do have the opportunity, if you wish, just to ask the meeting whether they're prepared to or content to ratify the decisions that we made earlier in the meeting, and that would mean that the report can go forward to the CA board recommendations, but as a resolution. Is that something that you want to do, Chair?
I'm content to do that. Can I just check, are there any dissenters from that proposal?
Happy to go with that approach, Chair.
Agreed. Thank you, Tim.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Okay, Tim, so that's fine. Thank you very much. So what we will do is we take Tim's update on the processes that we're using for the mayoral election. We'll get an update at the beginning of the March meeting as to where things are. And I suspect that will give us a greater opportunity to debate things. I apologise for letting the meeting overrun by 10 minutes.